The Hardy Boys, The House on the Cliff. A novel by Franklin W. Dixon. Chapter 1. Spying by Telescope. So, you boys want to help me in another case? Fenton Hardy, internationally known detective, smiled at his teenage sons. Dad, you said you're working on a very mysterious case right now, Frank spoke up. Isn't there some angle of it that Joe and I could tackle? Mr. Hardy looked out of the window of his second-floor study as if searching for the answer somewhere on the town of Bayport where the Hardys lived. Finally he turned back and gazed steadfastly at his sons. All right, how would you like to look for some smugglers? Joe Hardy's eyes opened wide. You mean it, Dad? Now just a minute. The detective held up his hand. I didn't say capture them. Just look for them. Even that is a big assignment. Thanks for giving it to us, Frank replied. The lean, athletic detective walked to a corner of the study where a long, narrow, carrying case stood. Tapping it, he said, You boys have learned how to manipulate this telescope pretty well. How would you like to take it onto the high promontory above the ocean and train it seaward? The place, I mean, is 2 miles north of the end of the bay and 8 miles from here. That would be great, said 17-year-old blonde-haired Joe, his blue eyes flashing in anticipation. Frank, who was a year older than his brother and less impetuous, asked in a serious tone of voice, Dad, have you any ideas about the identity of any of the smugglers? Yes, I do, Mr. Hardy answered, his tall, dark-haired son. I'm strongly suspected that a man named Felix Snapman is operating in this territory. I'll give you the whole story. The detective went on to say that he had been engaged by an international pharmaceutical company to trace stolen shipments of valuable drugs. Reports of theft had come from various parts of the United States. Local police had worked on the case, but so far had failed to apprehend any suspects. Headquarters of the firm is in India, the detective told the boys. It was through them that I was finally called in. I'm sure that the thefts are the result of smuggling, very cleverly done. That's the reason I suspect Snapman. He's a noted criminal and has been mixed up in smuggling rackets before. He served a long term in prison and after being released dropped just out of sight. And you think he's working around Bayport? Joe asked. He whistled. That doesn't make this town a very healthy place to live in. But we're going to make it so, Mr. Hardy declared, a ring of severity in his voice. Just where is this spot we're to use the telescope? Frank asked eagerly. It's on the Pollitt place. You'll see the name at the entrance. An old man named Felix Pollitt lived there alone for many years. He was found dead in the house about a month ago, and the place has been vacant ever since. It sounds as if we could get a terrific range up and down the shore from there, and many miles across the water, Frank remarked. Mr. Hardy glanced at his wristwatch. It's 1:30 now. You ought to be able to get out there, stay a fair amount of time, and still get home to supper. Oh, easily, Joe answered. Our motorcycles can really burn up the road. His father smiled but cautioned. This telescope happens to be very valuable. The less jouncing it receives, the better. I get the point, Joe conceded, then asked, Dad, do you want us to keep the information about the smugglers to ourselves, or would it be all right to take a couple of fellows along? Of course, I don't want the news broadcast, Mr. Hardy said, but I know I can trust your special friends. Call them up. How about Chet and Biff? Joe consulted Frank, and his brother nodded. He said, You pack up the telescope on your motorcycle, I'll phone. Chet Morton was a stout, good-natured boy who loved to eat. Next to that, he enjoyed being with the Hardys and sharing their exciting adventures, although at times when situations became dangerous, he wished he was somewhere else. Chet also loved to tinker with machinery and spent long hours on his jalopy, which he called Queen. He was trying to soup up the motor so he could have the real hot rod. In contrast to Chet, Biff Hooper was a tall and lanky boy. To the amusement and wonder of the other boys, he used his legs almost as a spider does, covering tremendous distances on level ground or vaulting fences. A few minutes later Joe joined his brother in the garage and told him that both Chet and Biff would go along. Chet, he said, had apologized for not being able to offer the Queen for the trip, but her engine was all over the garage. As usual, Frank said with a grin as the two boys climbed on their motorcycles to set out. Presently the Hardy boys stopped at Biff Hooper's home. He ran out the door to meet them and climbed aboard behind Joe. Chet lived on a farm at the outskirts of Bayport, about a 15-minute run from the Hooper home. The stout boy had strolled down the lane to the road and was waiting for his friends. He hoisted himself onto Frank's motorcycle. "I've never seen a powerful telescope in operation," he remarked. "How far away can you see with this thing?" "It all depends on the weather conditions," Frank replied. "On a clear day you can make out human figures at a distance of 24 miles. "Wow!" Chet exclaimed. "We ought to be able to find those smugglers easily." "I wouldn't say so," Biff spoke up. "Smugglers have the same kind of boats that everyone else has." "How close do you have to be to identify a person?" "Oh, about 2.5 miles," Joe answered. The motorcycles chugged along the shore road, with Frank watching his speedometer carefully. "We ought to be coming to the Pollitt place soon," he said finally. "Keep your eyes open, fellows." The boys rode on in silence, but suddenly they all exclaimed together, "There it is!" At the entrance to a driveway thickly lined with trees and bushes was a stone pillar into which the name Pollitt had been chiseled. Frank and Joe turned into the driveway. The only part of the house they could see was the top of the roof. Finally, beyond the lawn overgrown with weeds, they came upon the tall, rambling building. It stood like a beacon high above the water. Pounding surf could be heard from far below. "This place sure looks neglected," Biff remarked. Dank, tall grass grew beneath their towering trees. Weeds and bushes threatened to engulf the whole building. "Creepy, if you ask me," Chet spoke up. "I don't know why anyone would want to live here." The house itself was in need of repair. Built of wood, it had several sagging shutters, and the paint was flaking badly. "Poor old Mr. Pollitt was probably too sick to take care of things," Frank commented, as he looked at several weed-choked flower beds. To the Hardys' disappointment, the sky had become overcast, and they realized the visibility had been cut down considerably. Nevertheless, Frank unstrapped the carrying case and lugged it around to the front of the house. He unfastened the locks, and Joe helped his brother lift out the telescope and attached tripod, pulling up the eye-end section first. Biff and Chet exclaimed in admiration. "Boy, that's really neat," Chet remarked. He and Biff watched in fascination as Frank and Joe began to set up the telescope. First they unfastened the tape with which the tube and tripod legs were tied together. Joe turned the 3 legs down and pulled out the extensions to the desired height. Then Frank secured the tripod legs with a chain to keep them from spreading. "Now what's next?" Biff asked. "To get the proper balance for the main telescope tube, we slide it through this trunnion sleeve toward the eye end, like this." After doing so, Frank tightened the wing nuts on the tripod tightly. Joe picked up balance white from the carrying case and screwed it onto the right side of the telescope tube, about 1/3 the distance from the eyepiece. "This will keep the whole thing from being top-heavy," he pointed out. "And what's this little telescope alongside the big one for?" Chet queried. It's a finder, Frank explained. Actually, it's a small guide telescope and helps the observer sight this big telescope on the object more easily. It's as clear as mud, Chet remarked with a grin. He squinted through the ends of both the large and the small telescopes. I can't see a thing, he complained. Joe laughed. And you won't until you insert one of the eyepieces into the adapter of the big telescope and put another eyepiece on the finder. In a few minutes the Hardys had the fascinating device working. By turning a small knob, Frank slowly swung the telescope from left to right, and each boy took a turn looking out across the water. Not a boat in sight, said Chet, disappointed. Frank had just taken his second turn squinting through the eyepiece when he called out excitedly, I see something. He now began running account of the scene he had just picked up. It's not very clear, but I see a boat. Must be at least 6 miles out. What kind of boat is it? Joe put in. It looks like a cruiser or a cutter. It's not moving. Want to take a look, Joe? Frank's brother changed places with him. Say, fellows, a man going over the side on a ladder. And hey, there's a smaller boat down below. He's climbing into it. Can you see a name or numbers on the big boat? Frank asked excitedly. No. The boat's turned at a funny angle, and you can't see the lettering. You couldn't even if the weather was clearer. Which way is the man in the small boat heading? Biff asked. Seems to be going to Barnet Bay. Joe gave up his position to Biff. Suppose you keep your eye on him for a while, and also the big boat. Maybe we'll turn so you can catch the name or number on the box. Chet had been silent for several moments. Now he said, Do you suppose they are smugglers? Could be, replied Frank. I think we better leave and report this to Dad from the first telephone we... He was interrupted by the sudden, terrifying scream of a man. Where did that come from? Chet asked with a frightened look. Sounded as if it came from the inside, Frank answered. The boys stared at the house on the cliff. A moment later they heard a loud cry for help. It was followed by another scream. Somebody's in there and is in trouble, Joe explained. We better find out what's going on. Leaving the telescope, the 4 boys ran to the front door and tried the knob. The door was locked. Let's scatter and see if we can find another door, Frank suggested. Frank and Joe took one side of the house, Biff and Chet the other. They met at the rear of the old home and together tried a door there. This too was locked. There's a broken window around the corner, Biff announced. Shall we climb in? I guess we'd better, Frank answered. The boys reached the window, which seemed to open into a library, and they heard the scream again. Help! Hurry! Help! Came the antagonized cry. Chapter 2. Thief at Work. Joe was first to slide through the broken windows. Wait a moment, fellows, he called out, until I unlock this. Quickly he turned to catch the raised window, and the other 3 boys stepped inside the library. No one was there, and they ran into the large center hall. Hello, Frank shouted. Where are you? There was no answer. Maybe that person who was calling for help has passed out or is unconscious, Joe suggested. Let's look around. The boys dashed in various directions and investigated the living room with its old-fashioned furnishings, the dining room with its heavily carved English oak set, the kitchen, and what had evidently been the maid's bedroom in days gone by. Now it was heaped high with empty boxes and crates. There was no one in any of the rooms, and the Hardys and their 2 friends met again in the hall. The man must be upstairs, Frank decided. He started up the front stairway, and the others followed. There were several bedrooms. Suddenly Chet hung back. He wanted to go with his pals, but the eeriness of the house made him pause. Biff and the Hardys sped from one another to the many rooms. Finally they investigated the last of them. Nobody here. What do you make of it? Biff asked, puzzled. Chet, who had rejoined the group, said worriedly, Maybe the place is haunted." Joe's eyes were searching for an entrance to the third floor. Seeing none, he opened 3 doors in the hall, hoping to find a stairway. He saw none. "There must be an attic in this house," he said. "I wonder how you get to it." "Maybe there's an entrance from one of the bedrooms," Frank suggested. "Let's see." The boys separated to investigate. Suddenly Frank called out, "I found it!" The others ran to where he had discovered a door behind a man's shabby robe hanging inside a closet. This in turn revealed a stairway, and the group hurriedly climbed it, Chet bringing up the rear. The attic room was enormous. Old newspapers and magazines were strewn around among old-fashioned trunks and suitcases, but there was no human being in sight. "I guess that cry for help didn't come from the house at all," Biff suggested. "What will we do now? Look outdoors?" "I guess we'll have to," Frank answered. He started down the steep stairway. Reaching the foot, he turned the handle of the door, which had swung shut. To his concern, he was not able to open it. "What's the matter?" asked Chet from the top of the stairway. "Looks like we are locked in," Frank told him. "Locked in?" Chet wailed. "Oh no!" Frank tried pulling and pushing the door. It did not budge. "That's funny," he said. "I didn't see any lock on the outside." Suddenly the full import of the situation dawned upon the 4 boys. Someone had deliberately locked them in. The cries for help had been a hoax to lure them into the house. "You think somebody was playing a joke on us?" Biff asked. "Pretty rotten kind of joke," Chet sputtered. Frank and Joe were inclined to think that there was more to it than a joke. Someone had seen a chance to steal a valuable telescope and 2 late-model motorcycles. "We've got to get out of here," Joe said. "Frank, put your shoulder on the door and I'll help." Fortunately, the door was not particularly sturdy and gave way easily. Frank glanced back a moment as he rushed through and saw 2 large hooks, which he had not noticed before. They had evidently been slipped into the ice and had been ripped from the framework by the crash of the door. The other boys followed, running pell-mell through the hallway and clattering down the stairway. They dashed out the front door, leaving it open behind them. To their relief, the telescope still stood on the edge of the cliff, pointing seaward. "Thank goodness," said Joe. "I'd hate to have to tell Dad the telescope was gone." Frank rushed over to take a quick look through the instrument. It had occurred to him that maybe some confederate of the smugglers had seen them spying. He might even trick them into the house during the very time that a smuggling operation would be within range of the telescope. When Frank reached the edge of the cliff and tried to look through the instrument, he gasped in dismay. The eyepieces from both the finder and the telescope tube had been removed. As he turned to tell the other boys of his discovery, he found that they were not behind him. But a moment later Joe came running around the corner of the house, calling out, "The motorcycles are safe. Nobody stole them." "Thank goodness for that," said Frank. Chet and Biff joined them, all flopped down on the grass to discuss the mysterious happenings and work out a plan of action. "If that thief is hiding inside the house, I'm going to find him," Joe declared finally. "I'm with you," said Frank, jumping up. "How about you, Biff, guarding the motorcycles and Chet taking charge of the telescope? That way both the front and back doors will be covered too, in case the thief comes out." "Okay," the Hardys' friends agreed. As Frank and Joe entered the front hall, Joe remarked, "There's a back stairway. If we don't find the person on the first floor, I'll take that to the second. You take the front." Frank nodded and the search began. Not only the first, but the second and attic floors were thoroughly investigated without results. "There's only one place left," said Frank, "the cellar." This area also proved to have no hiding in it. "I guess the thief got away," Frank stated. "And probably on foot," Joe added. "I didn't hear any car, did you?" "No. Maybe he went down the cliff and made a getaway in a boat," Frank suggested. In a complete disgust, the Hardy boys reported their failure to Biff and Chet. Then they packed up the telescope and strapped it onto Frank's motorcycle. "We may as well go home," said Joe dolefully. "We'll still have a pretty slim report for that." "Slim?" said Biff. "I haven't had much excitement like this in 6 months." The boys climbed aboard the motorcycles. As the Hardys were about to start the motors, all 4 froze in their seats. From somewhere below the cliff came a demoniacal laugh. Involuntarily, the boys shuddered. "Let's get out of here," Chet urged. Frank and Joe had hopped off the motorcycles and were racing in the direction from which the eerie laughter was coming. "It may be another trap," Chet yelled after them. "Come back!" But the Hardys went on. Just before they reached the edge of the cliff, they were thunderstruck to hear the laughter coming from a completely different area. It was actually back of them. "What gives?" Joe asked. "Search me," his brother answered. "The ghost must have a confederate." The brothers peered over the edge of the cliff, but only to see jagged rocks that led to the booming surf below. Frank and Joe returned to their chums disappointed that they had learned nothing, and had no explanation for the second laugh. "I'm glad it stopped anyhow," said Chet. "It gave me goose pimples and made chills up and down my spine." Biff looked at his wristwatch. "I really have to be getting home, fellas. Sorry to break up this manhunt. Maybe you can take me to a bus and come back?" The Hardys would not hear of this, and said they would leave at once. They had gone scarcely a mile when the motor on Frank's cycle sputtered and backfired, then died. "A swell time for a breakdown," he said disgustedly as he honked for Joe to stop. Joe turned around and drove back. "What's the matter?" "Don't know." Frank dismounted. "It's not the gas. I've plenty of that." "Well, tough luck," Joe said sympathetically. "Well, let's take a look at the motor. Better get out your tools." As Frank opened the toolbox of his motorcycle, an expression of bewilderment came over his face. "My tools!" he exclaimed. "They're gone!" The others gathered around. The toolbox was indeed empty. "Are you sure you had them with you when we left Bayport?" Chet asked. "Of course I did. I never go anywhere without them." Biff shook his head. "I suppose the guy who took the eyepieces took your tools too." Joe dashed to the toolbox of his own motorcycle and gave a cry of dismay. "Mine are gone too!" Chapter 3. Landslide. "That's a shame, fellows," Chet Morton said. "That is sure your day of bad luck. First the eyepieces from your telescope are taken, and now the tools from your motorcycles." "And all by the same person, I am sure," Frank remarked grimly. "Some slick operator, whoever he is," Joe added gloomily. Chet put his hands into his trouser pockets and with a grin pulled out a pair of pliers, a screwdriver and a wrench. "I was working on the Queen this morning," he explained. "Good thing I happened to put these in my pocket." "I'll say," Frank declared gratefully, taking the tools which Chet handed over. He unfastened the housing of the motor and began checking every inch of the machinery. Finally he looked up and announced, "I guess I found the trouble, a loose connection." Frank adjusted the wires, and a moment later the vehicle's motor was roaring normally. The housing was put back on, Chet's tools were returned with thanks, and the 4 boys set off once more. "Let's hope nothing more happens before we get home," Biff said with a wry laugh. "I second that," Joe said emphatically. For 5 minutes the cyclists rode along in silence, their thoughts partly on the passing scenery, but mostly on the mystery in which they had become involved. Joe's mind was racing with his throbbing motorcycles. In a few minutes he had far outdistanced his brother. Frank did not dare go any faster because of the telescope strapped onto his handlebars. Presently Joe reached a spot on the road where it had been cut out of the hillside to the right. There was a sharp curve here. The motorcycle took it neatly, but he and Biff had scarcely reached the straightway beyond when they heard a thunderous sound back of them. "What's that?" Joe cried out. Biff turned to look over his shoulder. "A landslide!" he shouted. Rocks and dirt loosened by recent heavy rainstorms, were tumbling down the steep hillside at a terrific speed. "Frank!" Joe cried out in horror. He jammed on his brake and disengaged the engine. As he ran back to warn his brother, Joe saw that he was too late. Biff had rushed up, and both could stare helplessly, only their hearts sinking. Frank and Chet came around the corner at good speed and ran full tilt into the landslide. Its rumbling sound had been drowned out by the pounding surf and their own roaring motor. The two boys, the motorcycle and the telescope, were bowled over by falling rocks and earth. As the rain of debris finally stopped, Joe and Biff reached the sides. "Frank! Chet!" they cried out in unison. "Are you hurt?" Frank, then Chet, sat up slowly. Aside from looking a bit dazed, they seemed to be all right. "Rock just missed my head," Frank said finally. "I got a mean wallop on my shoulder," Chet panted gingerly, rubbing the sore spot. "You fellows were lucky," Biff spoke up, and Joe nodded his intense relief. "How about the telescope?" Frank asked quickly. "Take a look at it, will you, Joe?" The battering case pushed out of the straps which had held it in place on the motorcycle lay on the road, covered with stone and dirt. Joe opened the heavily lined box and carefully examined the telescope. "It looks right to me," he said in a relieved voice. "Of course, we won't know for sure until we try other eyepieces in it. But at least nothing looks broken." By this time Frank and Chet were standing up, and Biff remarked, "While you two are getting your breath, Joe and I can take the biggest rocks out of the way. Some motorist may come speeding along here and break his neck or wreck his car unless this place gets cleaned up." "Oh, I'm okay," Chet insisted. "The rock that hit me just felt like Bender, that big end on the Milton High team. He's hit me many times the same way." Frank, too, declared that he felt no ill effects. Together the boys flung rock after rock in the field between the roads and the water, and in pairs carried the heavier rocks out of the way. "Guess we're all set now," Frank spoke up. "Biff, I'm afraid you're going to be late getting home," he chuckled. "Who is she?" Biff reddened a little. "How'd you guess? I have a date tonight with Sally Sanderson. But she's a good sport. She won't mind waiting a little." Again the four boys straddled the motorcycles and started off. A few minutes later a noise out in the ocean attracted Frank's attention, and he peered across the rolling sweep of waters. A powerful speedboat came into view around the base of a small cliff a quarter-mile out. It was followed by a short distance by a similar but larger craft. Both boats were traveling at high speed. "Looks like a race," Joe called out. "Let's watch it." The Hardys ran their motorcycles behind a clump of trees and stopped, then walked down to the shoreline. The boats did not appear to be having a friendly speed contest, however. The first boat was zigzagging in a peculiar manner, and the pursuing craft was rapidly overtaking it. "See, the second boat is trying to stop the other one," Frank exclaimed. "It sure is. Wonder what's up," said Joe tensely. "I wish that telescope was working. Can any of you fellows make out the names on the boats?" "No," the other chorused. The two men standing in the bow of the pursuing craft were waving their arms fanatically. The first boat turned as if about to head toward the shore. Then, apparently, the helmsman changed his mind, for at once the nose of the boat was pointed out into the ocean again. But the moment of hesitation had given the pursuers the chance they needed. Swiftly the gap between the racing craft grew smaller and smaller until the boats were running side by side. They were so close together that a collision seemed imminent. "They'll all be killed if they aren't careful," Frank muttered as he watched intently. The lone man in the foremost craft was bent over the wheel. In the boat behind, one of the two men suddenly raised his arm high. A moment later he hurled an object through the air. It landed in back of the engine, housing the center of the craft. At the same time the larger boat sped off seaward. "What was that?" Chet asked. Suddenly a sheet of flame leaped high into the air from the smaller boat. There was a stunning explosion, and a dense cloud of smoke rose into the air. Bits of wreckage were torn high, and in the midst of it the boys saw the occupant hurled into the water. Swiftly the whole boat caught fire. The flames raced from bow to stern. "That man!" shouted Frank. "He's alive!" The boys could see him struggling in the surf, trying to swim ashore. "He'll never make it," Joe gasped. "He's all in." "We've got to save him," Frank cried out. Chapter 4. The Rescue. The Hardy Boys knew that they had no time to lose. It was evident that the man in the water had been injured by the explosion and could not swim much longer. "We'll never reach him," Chet said, as the four boys dashed across the rocks and grass to the shore. Suddenly Frank cried out, "I see a rowboat up on the beach!" His sharp eyes had detected a large rowboat, almost completely hidden in a small cove at the bottom of the cliff. "We'd make better time than that." A huge rock jutting out of the water cut the cove open from the part of the beach. "We have to go up on that ridge and then down," Joe objected. "I'll swim out." "I will too," said Biff. The two plunged into the water and struck out for the stricken man. Meanwhile Frank and Chet sped up the slope, cut across a strip of grass, and began running down the embankment toward the rowboat. "That man is still afloat," Frank said as he looked over out of the water. Joe and Biff were making good time, but were a long way from the man, who seemed now to be drifting with the ongoing tide. The explosion victim, fortunately, had managed to seize a piece of wreckage and was hanging onto it. Slipping and scrambling, Frank and Chet made their way down the slope. Rocks rolled and tumbled ahead of them. But finally they reached the bottom safely and examined the boat. It was battered and old, but evidently still seaworthy. There were two sets of oars. "Grab hold," Frank directed Chet. The boys pulled the boat across the pebbles and into the water. Swiftly they fixed the oars in the locks and took their places. Pulling hard, Frank and Chet rowed toward the distressed swimmer. Presently they overtook Joe and Biff, who clambered aboard. The man had seen the boys and called feebly to them to hurry. "Faster," Joe urged. "He looks as if he will go under any second." The motorboat in the background was still blazing fiercely, flames shooting high in the air. The craft was plainly doomed. The boys pulled hard, and the rowboat leaped across the water. When it was only a few yards away from the man, he suddenly let go his hold on the bit of wreckage and slipped beneath the wave. "He's drowning!" Chet shouted as he bent to his oar again. Joe made a tremendously long outward dive and disappeared into the water where the man had gone. Frank and Chet rowed the boat to the spot and leaned over the side to peer down. Just then Joe and the stranger broke the surface of the water, with the boys holding an arm under the man's shoulder. His head sagged. "He's unconscious," Biff whispered hoarsely as he helped pull the victim into the boat. The man sprawled helplessly on the bottom, more dead than alive. "We'd better revive him and get him to the hospital," said Frank. He applied artificial respiration, forcing a little water from the man's lungs, but the stranger did not regain consciousness. "I think he collapsed from exhaustion," Joe spoke up. Frank and Chet took off their jackets and wrapped them around the wet figure. "How about taking him to that farmhouse over there, along the road?" Chet suggested. The others agreed. As Frank and Chet rowed towards the farm, the boys discussed the mystery. Who was the victim of the explosion, and why had the man on the other motorboat tried to kill him? The man they had rescued lay face downward in the bottom of the boat. He was a slim, dark-haired man with sharp, clean-cut features, and his clothes were cheap and worn. Biff looked in his pockets for identification, but found none. "Wonder if he's a local man," Joe said. "Never saw him around town." The other boys declared they had never seen him either. By this time the boat was close to shore. Joe and Biff leaped out and dragged it part way up on the beach. Then the 4 boys carried the unconscious man up the rocky shore towards the farmhouse. At their approach a plump woman came hurrying out of the house. From the orchard nearby a burly man in overalls came forward. "My goodness, what has happened?" the woman asked, running toward them. "We just pulled this man out of the water," Frank explained. "We saw your house." "Bring him in," boomed the farmer. "Bring him right in." The woman ran ahead and held the door open. The boys carried the stranger into the house and laid him on a bed in comfortably furnished first-floor bedroom. The farmer's wife hastened into the kitchen to prepare a hot drink. "Rub his ankles and wrists and get those wet clothes off him," the farmer told the boys. "That will step up the circulations. I'll get some pajamas." "How about calling a doctor?" Frank asked. "No need. He'll be okay," the farmer declared. The victim was soon under the covers. Frank and Joe continued to massage his wrists and ankles. At last the stranger stirred feebly. His eyelids fluttered. His lips moved, but no word came. Then his eyes opened, and the man stared at those around him as though in daze. "Where am I?" he muttered faintly. "You're safe," Frank assured him. "You're with friends." "You saved me." "Yes." "Pretty near cashed in, didn't I?" "You nearly drowned, but you're all right now. When you feel like talking, tell us the whole story," said Frank. "But in the meantime, we'll call the police or the Coast Guard and report those men who tried to murder you." The man in the bed blinked and looked out the window. Finally he said, No, don't do that." The boys were shocked. "Why not?" Joe burst out. The man was thoughtfully silent for a moment and then said, "Thanks, but I'd rather let matters stand as they are. I'll take care of it as soon as I get my strength back." The rescued man turned to the farmer. "Okay with you if I stay here overnight? I'll pay you, of course." The farmer put out his hand. "The name's Kane, and you're welcome to stay until you feel strong. Nobody can say I ever turned a sick man away. And what's your name?" The patient hesitated a moment. "Jones. Bill Jones," he said at last. It was so evidently a false name that the Hardys glanced knowingly at each other. Mr. Kane did not seem to realize that his guest was apparently trying to hide his identity. Miss Kane appeared with hot broth and toast. She suggested that her husband and the boys let the patient rest for a while. When she joined them in the living room, she invited the boys to have a snack. Chet readily accepted for all of them. The snack consisted of sandwiches, of home-cured ham with cheese, glasses of fresh milk, and rich lemon pie, frothy with margarine. Chet beamed. "Miss Kane, you ought to open a restaurant. I'd be a red steady customer. You're the best pie maker I've ever met." Frank, Joe, and Biff chuckled. How often they had heard their stout, food-loving chum make similar remarks. But in this case they had to agree with him and told Miss Kane so. She smiled. "It's the least I can do for you boys, who just saved someone's life." Her young guest said nothing of the early afternoon's adventure inside the Pollitt house, but Frank cordially asked the Kanes if they had known the deceased owner, and if anyone was living there now. "I sure knew Felix Pollitt," the farmer replied. "Close-mouthed old codger. But I did hear him once say something about having a no-good nephew. Pollitt said he was his own living relative, and he supposed he'd have to leave the property to him." "But who want the place?" Miss Kane spoke up. "It's falling apart and would cost a mint of money to fix up." Joe grinned. "Sounds like a haunted house," he remarked pointedly. "Funny you say that." Miss Kane looked at Joe. "There was a family stopped here the other day, wanted to buy some eggs. One of the little girls said they'd had a terrible scare. They'd stopped at the old Pollock place to have a picnic, and were scared out of their wits by moans and groans and queer laughs from the house. Mr. Kane's face broke into a grin. The kid's imagination sure was running away with itself. I'm not so sure of that, his wife disagreed. I think some of the boys were in there playing pranks. After Frank and Joe and their friends had left the farmhouse, they discussed the strange noises at the Pollock place from this new angle. Biff frowned. If those ghosts are from Bayport High, they surely have to laugh on us, he remarked. They sure will, Chet agreed. I'd hate to face them on Monday. Frank and Joe were not convinced. After they had dropped their chums at the Morton and Hooper homes, they discussed the day's strange and varied adventures all the way to the Hardy house. I'm sure the girl's business was meant to be something more than a prank, Frank stated. Right, his brother agreed. I just had an idea, Frank. Maybe nobody was in the house, but he could have rigged up a tape recorder and made the sounds and remote control to start it. What say we go back sometime and take a look? I'm with you. By this time the boys had turned into the long driveway of the Hardy home, a spacious three-story clapboard house on the corner of High and Elm Streets. The large two-story garage in the rear of an attractive garden had once been a barn. Frank and Joe parked their motorcycles, unstrapped the telescope, and carried it back to the porch. As they entered the kitchen, they found their mother, a pretty sweet-faced woman, with sparkling blue eyes, preparing supper. "Hello, boys," she greeted them. "Did you have a good day? See any smugglers?" They kissed her, and Frank said, "We have a lot to tell you and Dad." "He's in the study upstairs. I'll go with you up right away, and we can talk while the chicken's roasting and the potatoes baking." The three hurried up to the room where Mr. Hardy was busy looking in a large metal file in which he kept important records. The detective stopped his work and listened with rapt attention as Frank and Joe gave a detailed account of their adventures. "We sure fell for that cry for help," Joe explained. "I'm so sorry about the stolen eyepieces from the telescope." "And I hope it wasn't damaged when I had my spill," Frank added. He smiled wanly. "You'll probably want to dismiss us from your detective force." "Nothing of that kind," his father said. "But now, let's discuss what you saw through the telescope. You said you spotted a man who climbed down the ladder of a boat and went off in a smaller one. Could he have been the same fellow who called himself Jones?" "We couldn't identify him," Joe replied, "but he might be." Frank snapped his fingers. "Yes, and he could be one of the smugglers." "But who threw that hand grenade at him?" Joe asked. "Not one of his own gang, surely. And those guys in the other speedboat, they couldn't have been the Coast Guard men, even in disguise. They wouldn't use grenades." "Joe's right on the second point," Mr. Hardy agreed. "But Jones may still be a smuggler." "You mean he might have done something to make his boss mad, and the boss sent out a couple of men to get him?" Joe asked. The detective nodded. "If this theory is right, and we can persuade Jones to talk before he either rejoins the gang or starts trying to take revenge, then we might get him to turn the state's evident." The boys were excited. Both jumped from the chairs, and Joe cried out eagerly, "Let's go and talk to him right away. By morning he will be gone."